Classes in Game Design, based on the books by George Phillies and Tom Vasel. Design elements of contemporary strategy games and contemporary perspectives in game design, both from Third Millennium Publications, http 3mpub.com/Phillies. And today, this lecture is Lecture 21. Simulating Movement and Combat in Wargame. This is IMGD 2500. We are advancing towards the end of the course. What just happened off camera is that each of the student design groups took the game they designed and then handed it off to another group to be play tested. And that's the second time we've done this. Playtest comments go back to the group, and next week we will have the distribution of the final game and the final playtest session. So that's where we are. And now we have a few questions and such not. And I guess the questions are, where are we? We are in the middle of discussing some modules I'm going to drop in on design of board war games. The point of dropping these in, we don't have a full wargame design course, though there was a fair amount of interest in it, but I am going to drop in some comments. The background on this is there are serious board war games which you can find in places like Consim World as an example site. Look up the classic Avalon Hill game Stalingrad if you want to see what real tactical discussion looks like. And these have fairly involved rules which ought to resemble the rules that you would expect to see in an orthodox computer game that attempted to do a decent job of simulating warfare. There historically have been a lot of these that, well, what can we say? So in any event, last time we were discussing movement. And the question is, how do you write movement rules to reflect the difficulty that it can be challenging to move through different sorts of terrain? I will draw squares, but everything I say would work equally well for hexagons, except it would take longer to draw. And the essential notion is, if you're going to describe unit positions, you more or less are stuck using some sort of gridding. The gridding can be quite fine scale, so in a computer game it may look as though you're using real continuous movement the way the physical world does, but you're really using some sort of gridding. And you then have a variety of paths for representing what is going to happen. And one path is we will put something inside the square that denotes some sort of terrain. And if we are a very bad artist, the little feature sticks out into the next square, leaving players to argue as to whether this terrain type acts here or not. If you're a competent artist, you don't make mistakes like that. So one thing you can do is to label the square itself. Another thing you can do is to label the boundaries between the squares. And historically, there have been reasons for doing each of these. On one hand, it would be nice to have a nice map which looks pretty as the players look at it. That's artistic appeal. Artistic appeal is important. On the other hand, you really, really want to be in a position where when the players try to play the game, the art does not get in the way of the gameplay. With computer games, the equivalent is you want to be sure that when the map goes to the people who are coding it, it gets coded properly so you don't, for example, have a major ocean in the middle of Kansas. This would be viewed as an error, unless it's supposed to be there. There have been a few variations on this. For example, one can find games where there's the side you're going to cross, and there is a numerical label, and the numerical label indicates the expense in movement points or whatever, impetus points, of getting from one square to the next by crossing this edge. Squares have a feature that hexagons do not, a rather important feature, and the rather important feature is that with squares you can reasonably have movement like this, and then you have to be somewhat careful about how you draw things to define how they affect diagonal movement. With hexagons, that issue cleanly goes away. So what sort of change, what sort of effects can you have? What sort of quantitative effects could you imagine implementing if you're setting up a game and you want to imitate movement? And it could be a board game or a computer game. And one thing you could say is cost to enter, for example, times 1 1/2 or times 2, so that if you have a unit that pays 1 movement point per space normally, suddenly it needs to pay 2 to get into the space. You could also say you have a feature cost to leave. Is this an issue? Yes, here's the swamp, and here is your unit full of little tanks, and getting out of the swamp can be a real nuisance unless you have fairly low tread pressures. And so you have a cost to enter, or you could pay as a cost to leave. You can also calculate it as a cost to cross. And in a certain sense, each of these are giving you the same effect, but you should realize they may look a little bit different to the players. They may actually play a bit differently depending on what you're saying. And of course, if this is the mountain range and you have to pay a cost to enter and in addition pay a cost to leave the swamp, you'd better think about the question of whether or not the effects are additive. Assuredly, if it's a computer game and you have decent coding, there is some answer in there, but the limit on this is that the players have to figure out what it is, unless you have a very well-written, detailed manual. So there's cost to enter, cost to leave. Another variation on this, I'll use swamp, I could use mountains, is you could say you can move into the swamp, but once you've moved into it, you have to stop for the turn. That is, the cost is variable. The cost is you can enter and you can then have to stop, and you then are allowed to advance 1 or 2 spaces a turn, depending on what the rules are. But there is a cost that is not a fixed numerical cost. It is a, that's it for now. So there are a variety of ways of setting up movement rules that actually get into the question of, well, how do you reflect what's going on? There are more implicit questions that are not obvious, one of which I want to emphasize, though I mentioned it a bit last time. You can, of course, look up speeds at which people can march or march down a road, or speeds at which you can drive a vehicle down a road or through different terrains. And it's very tempting to suppose that these speeds have some relationship to how fast a military unit can actually advance in this field. Well, they don't. Let us take an example of this. And the example we will take is the Army of Marlborough. This is early 1700s, and one of the many wars between England and France. And so we have people who Marlborough has carefully equipped with good shoes and replacements. That's a big deal in period. And they are going to road march down a road, and the question is, how many miles a day can this army advance in the absence of opposition down a road? And the answer is about 12. And what the statement, you can march about 12 miles a day, is, you form up the army in your camp, which you fortify overnight. The forward guard marches out to the new camp location. It has arrived at the new location, and is entrenching and doing all of the other things it's supposed to do. And the tail of the army, because this is a fairly large army on a single road, is still in the original camp, having not started marching. The message here is that unless it's a single person, it's not a mass point, it's a whole long object, and the front may get someplace, but people pile up. And if you have a formation, you have to allow that the rear starts moving rather after the front does, unless it walks in circles the whole time. How much does it pile up? Well, let's consider that army of Marlborough again. We are walking down an 18th century road, and 18th century roads in fact have the feature, they're not paved. The cart drivers go to the side to avoid really bad whatever. And so if an 18th century road is extremely wide by modern standards, calling it a road, well, you wouldn't want to take an automobile down it of any sort because it's full of holes and cart tracks and other things, but it's very wide. And so a typical marching formation, happens to be the French army. We have a dozen men across, and each man is separated from his neighbors by something like 2 feet and occupies 2 feet himself. And if you do the math, you realize this thing's 50 feet wide. And if we are in early 18th century, the gap here to the next person is about 6 feet. The reason there's a gap, first of all, we are in the early 18th century, and that means people have not yet invented either actually it's reinvented, marching in step, meaning everyone takes the steps of the same size, or marching in time, meaning all of the left feet kick off at the same time. That is a later reinvention. The Romans did that, and if you have people who are doing what would in modern army be called a route march, not marching in time, not marching in step, you need a fair amount of space around you or you keep bumping into your neighbors. This is just a practical matter. Furthermore, in most armies, you will have a certain number of laggards who don't march fast enough. In period, the process was, and what this means under modern conditions, someone lags behind and then runs, and everyone behind them has to run and catch up. Eventually, the drill sergeant passes the word. If someone behind you really starts lagging, don't give him space. Keep kicking him in the ankles, and he'll speed up. It works. Guaranteed. In period, the solution involves the fact that soldiers were punished by flogging. So here is this mass of people, very far apart, spread out. And the next question is, well, that's nice, and how do you turn these people in the real world? And of course, if you are simply doing this as a computer grid, you sort of draw a line like this, and it looks as though they just magically turn. And if you can't see the details, people may wonder what's happening. What actually happens is you get to the point where you are going to turn. This person stops or marches a certain distance forward. These people run, and I do mean run, because they have to cover all this distance to get the line turned so that they kick off this way before the next group of people get here. Turning an early period army, and remember, this thing's 50 feet across. It's not 4 men or women shoulder to shoulder. That's not too hard to do. This is a large sweeping turn. Those sorts of turns were the sort of thing where you had several senior officers standing there watching very carefully because disaster was potentially imminent. There was, however, an alternative way of turning, and the alternative way of turning, I will try to sketch. was that we reach here, and this is open order, so these people are like 6 feet apart. And this person turns and goes this way. And these people have advanced when he gets here. So this person goes between the two ranks and is now headed this way. And by the time this guy is here, he's advanced to here. And you have 12 ranks of people doing this. This is what is called an echelon turn. Someplace out on the web, there is a musical performance of the massed pipe bands of the British Light Division, and you can actually watch this done. And you can actually watch the obviously senior sergeants who are watching very carefully what has happened, because it's very tricky, especially since it's being done at a near run. The point I want to make is that if you say, we're going to do something simple like turning, it's movement. If you want to turn an automobile, okay, you put the wheel over. If you are turning a ship up through World War II, and the ship's headed this way, I want to turn this way, I'm holding the tiller, the wheel, which way do I throw the wheel? Point. You turn the wheel that way. It's the opposite of the way modern automobiles work. In World War II, they suddenly had large numbers of civilians who'd been drafted into the Merchant Marine and the Navy. And roughly in World War II, it was worked out. There were all these people who had the wrong instinctive reaction on which way to turn the wheel, and things got switched over. But if you go back to the 19th or 18th century, you're going to do a little animation. You can actually see the fellow turning the wheel to turn the sailing ship. Be sure you have it turning the right way. So that is movement. The other issue with movement is that if you actually want people to start moving, well, you can line them up in formation, and then you give some order like forward march. And if they're lined up and pointed the right way, this actually works. And if you have a line that is even several hundred people deep, this is a column, they'll all start marching because they're reasonably well trained. And there will be a little clumsiness at first because some people capture the rhythm faster than other people do, but you will actually get results. On the other hand, if you want to have a group of people who are sort of standing here in a group, advance to a position, you actually have to tell each group of people, and then the sergeants or file leaders tell each person where we are going. That takes a while. And actually getting things to happen is not instantaneous. This is a key point in warfare. It is called friction, and the point of friction is that in fact you have this large group of people, most of whom are in fact eager to please and do what needs to be done, unless your morale is rather bad. But actually getting it to happen is not trivial. The other half of that, which shows up not very well in some computer games, is that if you have a substantial number of people and you are going to attack a position, there are plans on how you do this that are drilled so you do it right. There are orders that are given, and you will, for example, have Group A sit here and provide covering fire. Group B head off that way. Group B has 1 or 2 people at point, so if you run into a hidden machine gun position, you don't all run into it. Only the person in point does, which is usually why point is rotated or given to whoever the sergeant really dislikes, or its punishment position because you've done something stupid. Nonetheless, you actually getting things to arrange, first of all, there are plans, they're quite detailed. They're like, for those of you who are interested in stadium spectator sports, they're typically more or less like football plans, except of course you have to adopt to terrain, so they can't be quite as detailed and require more thought on the part of the people who are doing them. The other half of this is that if something goes wrong, a good example of this was Jim Dunnigan's game, Squad Leader. And you have a unit and is advancing this way, and the opposition, this is a group of some dozens of men, and the opposition drops a few mortar rounds on it or fires a machine gun at it. There may not, if you have even one or two people who are wounded, especially if they're the sergeants or the platoon lieutenant, you have just stopped for about 30 minutes or an hour while people get their act together again. And so you have pinned where people are tied down under fairly limited response conditions. Okay, that's enough for movement. There is a huge amount of material out there that the military publishes on what to do in various situations, which if you actually end up designing combat games is worth looking at because it tends not to resemble what you see in some board and computer games. Let us advance from movement to combat. We'll start, since it's sort of contemporary, with fire weapons, meaning muskets, machine guns, whatever. And the first core issue is you want to remember that for all of the talk about marksmanship, which is greatly overrated, under most conditions, most gunfire is serving no purpose other than to persuade the other guy to keep his head down. The other point you want to remember is that under most conditions, the range at which you can actually see anything to shoot at it is quite limited. Go outside, look up and down the street, and ask yourself how far you can see before there's something in the way. A building, a tree, some tall shrubs, whatever, and you discover distances that you can actually see things are actually fairly short. The compensating part of this, since this sort of means you first encounter the other side when you're quite close to them, is that under conditions of combat, most people become alarmed because it's a good reason. They think they may die. And the ability of people to hit targets goes downhill rapidly. I'll go back to the 1700s example, the 18th century example. And here we have Frederick the Great and his army, the best trained army in Europe. It really was. And it had several secret weapons, the most important of which was you have a musket, you pour the gunpowder down the musket, you put something down the musket to compress the powder, and then you put down a wad, and then you put down the shot. And his secret weapon was the use of iron ramrods rather than wooden ramrods, because wooden ones broke with considerable frequency. As a result, he could get off about, his soldiers, which were well trained, could get off about 5 shots a minute under controlled but fast-firing conditions, while the other side could get off 2 or 3. And what he said about this is that if two groups close to the distance at which you would like to engage the enemy with fire, which was about 30 yards, meaning twice the depth of this classroom maybe, the two sides would sit there shooting at each other. After about 15 minutes, this is Frederick the Great, the enemy ranks become indistinct. Not everyone is dead, just the ranks have become indistinct. And at this point, you can effectively charge with the bayonet, which was the weapon you had which could actually kill people. Big, sharp, spear-like thing. So you notice the mortality rates were a bit limited, the target was a bit limited. At 100 yards, which by modern standards, that's just the length of a football field, If you had two long groups of men take a volley at each other, 1% of the shots might hit the opponent. And remember, these are people on both sides. They're dense packed. You have to get in someplace within about 5.5 feet off the ground, anywhere in that direction. This is on level ground. If you were fighting on a slope, things were much worse because there was actually not a good theory of how you should tilt your musket if you were firing up or downhill. The weapons were actually more accurate than that. There was in the Marlburian Wars, there was a battle event in which the French King's Infantry Guard, you remember the Three Musketeers? It's a real combat unit. And what they were told, after all, these were all nobility. They were officers who knew how to hunt. They were given the instruction, take time to aim your weapon. We must have every shot count. They did. Afterwards, the comment was that everyone was totally astonished by how many enemy soldiers had died fairly close in. It was a column charge coming in fast. They had never seen anything like it on the battlefield. But that's not the way armies usually fought in period. Under modern conditions, under modern conditions with rifles that you can aim, you do occasionally see someone shot with a rifle, but most of the casualty toll is artillery, mortar rounds, bombs, machine gun fire, and the purpose of the infantryman to some extent is to escort the folks with the heavy weapons. This got improved a bit when everyone was equipped with weapons that could fire on full automatic. Namely, unless you are very good, you fire on full automatic and you can run out of ammunition, hundreds of rounds of it in almost no time at all. So we have the question of simulating combat. And the first issue is that you aren't, to some extent, you are trying to kill the opponent. This is a good thing. But you should realize, especially for pre-mid-20th century infantry combat, basically a certain modest number of people die, and the remainder remember an important appointment many miles in the rear and start running. And that was actually how battles worked, and that is actually to some extent what you're trying to simulate. The break point on that, by the way, is the American Civil War. The American Civil War was the first war fought by people with rifled muskets, where you actually had a reasonable chance of hitting someone if you aimed at them. And therefore, with rifled muskets, the Napoleonic techniques, charging in column or charging in packed line, were basically suicidal, as both sides learned the hard way. In prior wars, the effects were much lower, and you should realize that there was not much of a consequence. Now, you will occasionally see descriptions of, well, the Americans hid behind trees in the Revolutionary War and sniped at people with their rifles, and that is basically nonsense, almost but not completely nonsense. The first issue is that period rifles, this is prior to the invention of the mini ball. So here is, if you look down the rifle, there are grooves that have been cut in it. That's what rifling is. And if you look down, you should remember that you could be looking down a loaded weapon. The grooves spiral as they go backwards, and therefore the bullet that is coming out of the rifle is spinning like this, and therefore it does not tumble or various other unfortunate things. Also, it's pointed instead of straight, a sphere. Spheres have horrible aerodynamics. The radical invention after our Revolutionary War was the mini ball. Mini was a French fellow. And the rear of his rounds contained this little area with very thin plates that had slices through them. when you detonated the gunpowder here, these very thin plates were spread out and shoved into the grooves, incidentally cleaning the grooves as they went down. And therefore, to load a mini ball, you just dropped it in and it would drop to the bottom. Revolutionary War rifle, you had to hammer the ball down, which took considerable time, like 30 seconds or a minute. And since you were firing gunpowder, which does a fine job of clogging everything with residue, after a few rounds you might not be able to load the weapon again. Incidentally, while you're spending a minute or two reloading, you should realize there is no point in hiding behind trees to hide your positions with powder weapons, because the moment you shoot, there's this large black cloud of smoke revealing exactly where you are. And if you have 200 guys, if you have several thousand guys lined up, all making large black clouds of smoke, after about the first few rounds fired on each side, you can't see anything unless there is good wind condition, and visibility drops to almost zero. So that's what you're trying to simulate, and the question is how you go about simulating it. Well, for small units, you can do actual legitimate estimates of how effective weapons are, and you can then go in and put in numerics, and you can then test, see if you get reasonable answers. For example, the Battle of Concord Bridge, start of the American Revolution. Americans and British, several hundred on each side, are separated by the rushing torrent of the brook, which is wide enough that you can barely turn a canoe around if you're careful. And they blasted away at each other for 10 or 15 minutes. And neither side took really severe losses. So you should see if you get reasonable numbers out of it. But the short form is you can do simulations. You can also do simulations of edged weapons, combat weapons. If you do that, you have to realize that a significant issue is fatigue, especially if you're wearing large amounts of armor. This gets exaggerated a bit. People wearing conventional battle armor could stand up if they fell down. If you hear references to some of the French-English battles like Crécy and Agincourt, you should realize there had been torrential rains and you were discussing wading through a foot or a foot and a half of mud, which is not quite hard terrain. That's a little different. Okay, so how do you actually simulate this? Now that I have given all of the problems you have, how do you simulate this? And the core answer, especially if you want to do large-scale units, is you go back to Charles Roberts and his game Tactics, 1953. There are a few more recent games there are a few games less recent that capture pieces of this, going back to H.G. Wells, the guy who wrote War of the Worlds. He also wrote some rules for fighting battles with toy soldiers, though his rules were actually much more primitive. And the general notion is that you have military units of some size, and you assign to them a numerical value, or maybe two numerical values, one for attack and one number for how good they are at attacking, and one good number for how good they are at defending. And you then allow that if you have a whole group of units on the other side, all attacking, and this fellow is defending, the simple simulation is to say, we will just add all of these numbers up and compare it with the defense strength. Now, the approach used by Roberts, there are alternatives, was to say we will take a ratio, and therefore, And therefore, if we have 60 factors attacking and 20 factors defending, that reduces to a 3-to-1. And now, having said this, he said, well, yeah, we have some strength, or we have some larger or smaller strength. And then there's a stochastics part. There is a random part. And the random part reflects the fact that if you launch battles between two units of different sizes, the same thing won't happen every time. Now, if the odds are sufficiently overwhelming in one direction or the other, the outcome is certain, but only the fine details differ. And so what he did is to say, okay, we know a ratio of defense strengths. This is the most primitive approach. And we will set up a table. So we have 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 2-to-1. And then we will say there are various outcomes that we attach to die rolls. And so we have die rolls 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And, okay, so what sort of results can we plausibly have? Well, one result, if we're really outnumber the other guy, this is his approach, is to say the defender is eliminated, wiped out. In practice, with large units, wiped out does not mean 100% casualties. Wiped out representatively means if 10 or 15% casualties and the unit is going to be badly shaken up and need to be somewhat reassembled. If you get up to 30 or 50%, the unit has basically been wrecked, and reconstituting it is a major issue. You could also say, this was something else he said, exchange. He's trying to get across the notion that even if you win, there can be attrition. And that says this unit is off of the board, but an equal strength of defenders is also off of the board. You then, of course, need, since these units aren't being annihilated, it's not like the US Army facing the Martians in War of the Worlds, or the real-world version of this, the Iraqi army attempting to fight in the first Iraq War. Well, there's some attrition on each side, and these units are recycled because most of the equipment is still there, most of the people are still there. And another result, and you can be much more explorative on this, is to say defender is knocked back some number of spaces, and the attacker gets to advance. That is, you knock these people out of the position, and you get to move into it as a result of combat. And so that was the simplest possible thing you could envision. However, he had many cleverer approaches and many cleverer approaches have been done since. For example, you could say you have combat, and instead of units being wiped out, you have step loss. The point of step loss is that you have a unit. We will do Avalon Hill 1914. And a German infantry corps was, if I recall correctly, a 710-3. That's if it's fully ready to go in all respects. But after combat, if it's taken losses, its attacking strength isn't as strong, its defending strength isn't as strong, it probably can move about as fast. And if it has losses in another round of combat, it might be down at 4 attack and 6 defense. It moves just as fast. And then if it's really wrecked up, it might be that, and it's almost ineffective in combat, but it's still there. You can't just walk through the space. And after that, it's dead, it's gone. And you can throw units away. In most periods, really, there were several limited ways to get truly massive casualties. One was to be surrounded so you couldn't make an escape. And units that get surrounded, well, even in World War II, it was sometimes the case. You're surrounded, your infantry can exfiltrate at night, and you just lose your equipment. The other choice, if you're surrounded and have doctrine for dealing with this, is, okay, we've been surrounded. We get to attack in a new direction and the enemy is in front of us. But we get to attack. That's actually a very hard maneuver to pull off successfully. So that's step loss. Another thing you could do instead of saying step loss, in some periods, G, you have all these folks wielding spears or swords or whatever, and they're standing shoulder to shoulder. And on one hand, they know the only way they're going to successfully engage the enemy is to close, probably through arrow fire, and therefore they're considerably more willing to close than soldiers of later periods were. This leads to the interesting observation of one English historian that a Napoleonic army, because gunpowder weapons in period weren't that effective, would probably be challenged to engage successfully a well-handled Alexander the Great spear army, because once there was closure, guys with bayonets could not compete with a sarissa, big spear with a sharp pointy thing on the end. Having said that, the issue then is morale, namely if you start seeing people around you die, this tends to reduce your interest staying around. If you are walking forward and the friendly unit in front of you suddenly turns around and starts running towards you because they've had enough, this is really very bad on morale, and the people marching forwards suddenly decide to join them, which is why in Napoleonic army, if you were formed line, the sergeants were at the back of the line with their pistols, the officers were behind them with pistol and sword, and the duty of the sergeants and the officers was to shoot dead any soldier of his own side who turned to run. That actually is true as recently as World War II, even in the American Army, though we spread out more. People who ran generally became casualties, or at least sometimes became casualties. And so that is morale, and G, representing it is another part of combat, which we will get to on the next lecture. Tomorrow, however, is the lab. Be ready to go. Have a good day.
Let's run the library. Ours is like short videos. Yeah, classical 5 between classes. We're trying to figure out how everyone can get there.